My voice is loud, but if you want to use the mic, I can use the mic.
Yeah, use the mic.
Use the mic. Use the mic. Use the mic. All right. Okay, let me just tell you a little bit about the book before we get into our presentation for the day, and then we'll have a period of Q&A. This is my latest book, and again, as Paul talked about, it's about Zora Hurston. I taught a class in which I have used Their Eyes Were Watching God for many years. And I began to notice there was a lot about food in the book and wanted to know, is that the case with her other work? And so I spent a year on sabbatical down at Harvard University doing research, and within 6 months I had a first draft of the book because there was that much material. So within the book, what you learn is about Zora growing up, her experience. We talk about the garden that she grew up for her family, but also the experience that she had out doing research as a ethnographic anthropologist. And she's doing a lot of research and asking people about their food, observing their food, and food remedies. So I want to tell you, there's a couple chapters that will be very interesting. I know that, Paul, you made a really good chicken soup, is that right?
Yes, I did.
Well, Zora Hurston, when she went to New York to go to school, she went to Barnard College. And she had a very difficult time financially. It was a period in her life where her father forsaked her after the passing of her mother. And she was on her own. One of the ways that she thought about bankrolling her undergraduate education was to open a catering business that would focus solely on chicken-related dishes. So there's a whole chapter in the book on chicken because it played that much of a role in her own work and her observations. There's a whole chapter on barbecue. There's a chapter on the African American table which talks about all the different aspects that you would find on a special occasion at an African American table, including what Jason was talking about with sweet potatoes. And throughout the chapters, there are related recipes from the same time period. So I went in to largely historically African American newspapers, which are now defunct, but the sources are there, and pulled out those recipes from the time period. So there are recipes in here from 1890s, which she was born in the 1890s, all the way up through the 1940s, 1930s, 1950s, and they stop around that time period because that covers the span of her life. And they're very interesting. I have a course that I teach at Babson, and it's an online course. So the students right now are taking their final exams, but the students are going to be taking this online course. The course starts on January 5th, and it's a very intense 2 weeks. Before they leave campus, we had a 2-day, 90-minute session as part of that course. And what I did was I pulled recipes from the novels that it's a course called Food in the African American Canon. So we look at some of the most important works in African American literature like Invisible Man, Autobiography, Next Colored Man, on and on and on. And each and every one of those books, by the way, has a lot of food content. So we pulled the recipes that were related in the newspapers to sections in that. Anybody probably remember the famous yam scene in Invisible Man that happens on the streets of Harlem. So we had recipes like that. So on Thursday, we had a menu that included fried chicken, fried rabbit, sweet potato pone. We had key lime pie, cornbread, biscuits, watermelon rind jelly. These are all recipes related to what's in the books. And a lot of the recipes I just mentioned are also in this book. So it's not just a history book, but it's also a cookbook, a recipe book. Yesterday, we had a breakfast session, and so we had shrimp and grits, Cajun style, and then we also had strawberry jam, and we had, I'm trying to think of the other, and half and half tea. So again, for a lot of the students, that was the first time eating grits. I know for many of us in this room, you may have southern roots. So if you didn't grow up down south, a lot of these kids, that was the first time. Now, I quickly found out who the southerners were on the staff because after the students left and they had food left over, I just started walking around the office and said, hey, you hungry? You got shrimp and grits. And the southerners were the first one to pop up and go downstairs and eat. So those are things. I need to know, does anybody here have a birthday today? A birthday today? Anybody have an anniversary today?
Get a copy of the book.
Did anybody here, did you give birth today to a child. Wow, I've never gone this far. I usually can give away a book.
What about who traveled the hardest?
How about on the 10th?
On the what?
On the 10th.
On the 10th, you gave birth? Well, then you get the book. Okay? See me afterwards, and I will sign it. I also would invite you to go to my blog, which is real simple to remember. Just go to fredopie.com. There's a link to the blog, and every day there's a story with a related recipe and a related historical image. And then there's a podcast called The Dinner Table that you would probably enjoy, where a lot of the work I've done, a lot of interviews, I record different things and for people who are interested in that kind of information. There's a whole series on the blog called Eating from Your Garden that you probably would all like. And it just comes from years and years of work that I've done on gardens, and also looking at gardens in historical contexts like victory gardens during World War II, periods like that. Okay, so I just want to let you know about that before we get going. As you can see here, we're going to talk about gardens, remedies, and recipes, and I hope that you find the information interesting, and also that I will make sure that I come back and have time for Q&A. So to make sure the timer here is working before we go any further, so we don't go over here. Nope. All right. This is a terrific quote that you may not be able to read in the back of the room, so I'll read it for you. It says, "When an old man dies, a library burns to the ground." I mean, stop and do a Selah on that. I mean, that's a very serious quote right there. And it comes from an African proverb. When an old man dies, a library burns to the ground. And the same thing with an old woman. And I want you to think about that as I share what we learned from our elders and ancestors about gardens, recipes, and remedies. This is an image from the antebellum period. It's a Reconstruction era period, actually. And it's an image of black soldiers who, I believe this is South Carolina, that were given land and they are farming and they are growing sweet potatoes. And what's interesting is the technology that's involved here. They're using a long-handled hoe, and that hoe comes directly from Africa. Now, there's a lot of things that people don't necessarily know about what came during the African slave trade, but this technology. So the whole rice growing culture that we know in low country Georgia, low country South Carolina, came from Africans. When British colonists came here and they were looking for a cash crop, they stumbled onto what the enslaved people that they owned were growing, and quickly realized that this was a cash crop that would be worth investing. And we know shortly after that became the case that the rice became known as Carolina gold. It was that profitable. But it was all done around technology that came from the region we know, the Senegambia region of West Africa. That's Sierra Leone, Senegal, those areas right in there. But that handle is something that is what we call an African survival. And it's been used in many parts of agriculture since the first arrival of Africans here in the Americas in 1625 in Virginia. And it's spread throughout the South. This is a book that would be worth writing down. It's Esteban Montejo, who was an enslaved man in Cuba, and it's his autobiography. Many people know about the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, who I'm named after a number of. But this is a really interesting autobiography. Now, think about the contrast. Slavery was abolished here in the United States in 1865. Slavery wasn't abolished in Cuba until 1882. So the African survivals continued much longer, and shipments of enslaved Africans legally and illegally arrived in the port of Havana, Cuba for much longer than they did in Charleston and some of the other ports we know here. And the survivals continued. This book has
mine for learning a lot about gardens and subsistence gardens that enslaved people, not only in Cuba, but similar phenomena you see throughout the South. And I want to talk a little bit about what we learned from him and just pull out some things. There's a whole lot more stories from Esteban Voltejo that are part of a series I've done on him in my blog. He dictated his life story to an anthropologist when he was about 101 years old. And it was vivid. I mean, it was clear. He was very clear in his reflections on his experience, and we learned a lot. So let's talk a little bit about what he says. Again, some of you in the back can't read this already for you. During slavery, he says, quote, "You couldn't find a doctor anywhere." So I've done presentations that talk about, and I know we have a number of docs in the room, but there's often the story of medical disparities. And if you were an enslaved person, that was your reality. You could not depend on medical doctors for your treatment. You know, many of us who are African Americans grew up where our grandparents, particularly if you had a sprained ankle or something, what did they tell you to do? Go soak it in? Okay. Let me be really clear. That was the attempt of slave masters to deal with your infirmity in as cheap a way as possible. It had very little to do with the benefit of doing that. And it became a cure-all for many things for enslaved people and continued even in my childhood growing up with one grandparent from Virginia over North Carolina. But we learned a lot that enslaved people had to depend on the knowledge that came from Africa. And this is a really interesting quote that you get from Esteban. He says, "The Africans from over there." So again, there's two different types of people. If you were purchasing slaves, you could purchase what was known as a Zambo. A Zambo was an enslaved African who never had time to be broken in. Translation, learn Spanish if you're in Cuba, learn Catholicism, and learn how to behave like an enslaved person. It was the Africans, those who came directly over the Zambos, who were less expensive. They tend to be the ones that would lead rebellions, become the head of Maroons, and they also were the ones that knew the most about African survivals related to food and remedies. So he says the African from over there, being on the other side of the Atlantic, doesn't ever get sick. Imagine that. He says the Africans don't ever get sick because he has all the herbs within his reach. Imagine the ability to just walk out in the back of your yard, in the woods, and when you're sick, just go pick the right thing, prepare the right thing, and you're assured that you're going to be cured. And many of us have had grandparents, great-grandparents, who had that knowledge. And unfortunately, a lot of information has not been recorded, and we're losing it. There are other people who are trying actively to keep that alive. But that is a really profound quote to me when I think about this whole idea of the African. So when people got sick, they knew there were certain people within the community where they lived who had that knowledge. And if you went there, you had a chance to be cured. Go back one. Here's another one. Again, he's talking about honey and fresh water, which to me is so interesting because if you look at the current debate about obesity in our society, we know that if we could just get Americans to cut down on the consumption of soft drinks, very sugar-laden soft drinks, and what's every doctor tell you when you go in there? You need to drink more water, right? So this is a guy who's had the experience, and while he's growing up and he's living in slavery from the 1860s, 1870s, all the way up until he dictates this, he talks about water. He says, "The water was better for you than any of today's medicines." I mean, pretty profound. I have a friend that I know who recently was diagnosed with cancer. And one of the things that she suspects now that she's going into treatment and surgery, and one of the things that she acknowledged, she was never a person who drank enough water. She just didn't hydrate herself. She would hydrate herself with sweet artificial drinks. And it makes a huge difference if you can flush your system out with water. Imagine if you had a garden and the only thing you gave it was soda pop and Kool-Aid. I mean, what's the chances of really having a flourishing garden? Well, your body is not going to flourish if you don't give it fresh water. And he says that just these two things, fresh water and honey. I was mentioning to the people before we got here, another name you should know about, I just learned a new one I have to learn about too, is Dr. Alvinia Fulton. Can you raise your hand if you're familiar at all with that name, Dr. Fulton? Oh, it's interesting. Go onto the blog, foodexcellence.com, and put in just Fulton, or Dr. Fulton. She was a naturopath doctor, holistic doctor, originally from Tennessee, migrated to Chicago, and through her own illnesses and problems, she discovered the benefits of natural medicine. She was the dietitian and mentor of Dick Gregory. I was telling somebody, the NBA Hall of Famer, Bill Walton, used to fly in on a monthly basis, go in, get his herbs, everything he needed, and then go back out and play. She dealt with a number of people, from Red Fox to other people who were actors that knew about her work. She was in the South Side of Chicago, and she dedicated her life. I saw her speak at Howard University in the late 1980s, and at that time, she looked like she might have been early 60s, mid-60s. And she died about 20 years after that. And when she died, she was close to 100, but she never looked at it. I mean, she would make a bicep that Jason would compete with you. You know, and she was one of these people, she thought, punch me in the stomach. I mean, she just was built like a brick house. But it was how she ate. And one of the things that I learned when I interviewed her nephew, who worked in her shop, in her restaurant with her, is the only sweetener that she used was honey. She considered white sugar death. She just didn't mess with it at all. And it really made me think when he talked about that, the importance of honey. And then when I read this, it's just a confirmation. Here's another one that Esteban says. Esteban spent a lot of his life as a runaway in the mountains of Cuba, in the forest area. And so a lot of this is his reflection on how he survived during that time period. There's a leaf that he talks about, the guanilla leaf. He says if you make a coffee out of it, you sweeten it with honey. And he says, what does it do? It gives strength to the body. So again, these are just things that we know that are coming out of the gardens, or in this case, his foraging that's going on, that he recommends and he explains to people how he survived and did it so well. I think we have one more from Esteban, and we have a couple from Zorno Hurston. Here's a brew he made with the cajini berries with honey. Again, he talks about that honey again. Cures head colds and nasal congestion. Now, I'm probably not the only one that's been blowing my nose more often than I like to lately. But think about it. Cures head colds and nasal congestion and doesn't give you any negative side effects. So it's amazing if you think about what this person knew, and if we could tap into it now, the benefit we would have in dealing with healthcare disparities. Zora. So let's talk about Zora. She's born in, as I mentioned, in the late 1890s. She's actually born in Alabama, but her family moves to Florida, where she spends her time growing up in Eatonville, which is one of the oldest all-black townships in the United States. She was one of these people who was extremely vain and never told people how old she really was. By the time she got to Barnard College in New York, she was a 27-year-old freshman, but everybody thought she was 19, 20 years old. She spent time going to a very privileged boarding school in Jacksonville, same school where Howard Thurman met. Howard Thurman was a theologian, was a mentor of MLK. You also had, what's his name, the autobiography of ex-colored man Johnson and his brother. These two brothers went there, the Johnson brothers. The one brother, well, both of them composed Lift Every Voice and Sing. They all went to the same school, so a number of very privileged people went there. She stayed there, and then from there, she traveled around, kind of floundered, and then she ended up getting on track. But what's interesting is learning about her experience growing up in Eatonville. And what Jason mentioned, and a number of people probably have heard this in your breakout sessions, is that her family really didn't need to go to a store except for very little things. that they could produce because they had a garden that produced just about everything they needed. They raised so many chicken and had so many eggs that they used to use them for torpedoes. They just had everything they needed. Chicken, she said at the point where she got sick of eating chicken, so much chicken. Fish all the time. And these are all things that are around her. And she talks about these things, and you see, in many ways, her research is reflecting on the experience of growing up in her community. So I'm going to talk about some of the things here. This is a woman in Florida, and it reminds me of what Zora would have been doing with her own mother, is in their collard green patch. Collecting. Now, I would say, if you're trying to convert somebody and improve their eating habits, you give them things that you actually pick and then cook right away. I mean, the taste is phenomenal. Now, and the course I do on Africa, one of the things that you learn from Africans is that they don't go to the store and buy dead chickens in cellophane. Same thing with people who were born and raised in Asia and Latin America. And matter of fact, one of my students, she's from China. She was sitting in the class the other day when we were talking about that. I think it was Thursday night. In China, she said, if the chicken's dead, people suspect there's something wrong with it. It's not healthy. A lot of the fish, you buy the fish with the eyes in it because you can tell the fish was healthy enough. So it's just something to think about. If people in other countries realize, buy it while it's alive, kill it yourself,